The pen is more powerful than the sword. And other lies you can tell yourself. One of the myths that I've seen going around about Chile's democratic transition was that Pinochet was simply defeated after being voted out by the public. That beating him was simply a matter of crossing a line on a piece of paper. But the truth is, none of this would have happened had it not been for the sweat and blood that was spilt by ordinary men and women who simply wanted to live in peace. Between 1983 and 1988, Chile experienced some of its largest recorded protests up until that point. The main strategy of the opposition was to use civil unrest to pressure Pinochet into giving them concessions. It is because of this that the plebiscite of 1988 was held under fair conditions, all thanks to the efforts of common people. For several years, Chileans faced off against the regime's security forces in a long and difficult fight for their freedom. Despite the risks, there were a small minority of people who were willing to take the fight to the extreme. Over the course of the dictatorship, hundreds, if not thousands, joined the ranks of armed groups and, instead of using sticks and stones, fought their war with guns and bullets. This is the story of Chile's armed struggle against Pinochet. During the Cold War, specifically the 1960s and 70s, there was a surge in new left-wing ideologies, commonly referred to as the New Left, who opposed Soviet-style communism and the revisionism of social democrats. The MIR was founded by Miguel Enriquez and several of his associates on August 15, 1964, as an alternative to traditional leftist political parties. The MIR was meant to act as the vanguard of the workers and the oppressed. The faction's main goal was the destruction of the capitalist system and the construction of a government run by the workers and the peasants. The MIR considered Chile's current political and economic system to be illegitimate, thus they justified the use of force. The formation of bands of guerrillas was considered as a success that it saw in Cuba. However, it was believed to be unlikely that the same strategy could be replicated in Chile, as the country had a small rural population and the left was usually dominated by traditional parties. To obtain power, Bautista von Schauen, I think that's how you pronounce it, presented a document titled Insurrectional Strategy. To summarize the document, it was divided into three parts. Number 1, the necessity of violence and armed struggle during the current period. Number 2, the possibility of armed struggle in Chile. Number 3, the character of armed struggle in Chile. Mass struggle, short insurrection, or prolonged revolutionary war. The MIR's early activities consisted of student protests for reform in the 60s, land seizures, and later bank robbing, a move that would get them outlawed by the government of Eduardo Frei Montalva. The MIR knew that one day they would have to fight a revolutionary war, and began preparing for it. Guillermo Rodrigo Morales, a young man who had joined the organization at the age of 15, would work his way up the ranks and was eventually given military training. One day he was assigned a new task, to join a unit of bodyguards to defend the newly elected president, Salvador Allende. Miguel Enriquez made a deal with Allende's UP that they would stop robbing banks and would establish a bodyguard unit known as the Gap to defend the president. However, this deal soon fell apart after several incidents involving alcohol, guns, and a car crash. Actually, no, I think it was a few car crashes. Now, before leaving, the MIR stole around half of the Gap's arsenal, which included assault rifles and rocket launchers, because, it's not like Allende was going to need this stuff anytime soon. These men made up what was called the Central Force, a small unit of well-trained soldiers that formed the fist of their military apparatus. Preparations for war would continue, as in 1971, around 45 to 50 members of the MIR went to Cuba to receive military training. During the Tanquetazo, Guillermo Morales and his buddies believed that the Central Force would engage the mutineers in defense of the government. However, that never happened. The reason why the MIR didn't come to the defense of Allende was because they simply were unable to. Andrés Pascal Allende, not a relative of the president, said that Miguel Enriquez did try to confront the mutineers, but was unable to mobilize the Central Force at the time. There were problems with communication, and everyone was spread out and far from their arsenals. Despite the MIR possessing around 10,000 members, 300 to 400 of which had received training, and, well, they struggled to arm themselves. Quite frankly, the movement that was preparing to fight a revolutionary war was incapable of fighting a revolutionary war. On September 11th, 1973, the time to fight finally came. The military was conducting a coup, and if the left wanted to stop it, would have to act. Aside from the bitter resistance put up by Allende and a few dozen militants in La Legua, the left's response to the coup was rather lacking. Guillermo Morales and his group of militants wandered around Santiago, trying to organize some form of resistance until they were eventually caught. After he and the others were brutally beaten by their captors, they were supposed to be executed, but were saved by another group of carabineros who claimed to be sympathetic. He and the others were taken to the Estadio Nacional, where, at the very least, the odds of them being executed were lower. Eventually, he was put on trial and sent to jail, but in 1975, he was released and deported to Canada along with 100 other political prisoners as part of a deal with the Canadian government. With that, Morales would be given the chance to continue his fight against Pinochet. Unfortunately for most, they wouldn't be so lucky if they were caught. Wanting to avoid capture, many people started to flee the country, either because they were ordered to, or because of their own volition. Many members of political parties, such as the Communists, were ordered to leave the country. Luis Canales, who was later known as the Hat Man, was one of them. Unfortunately, his family couldn't follow, and his son, who fought in the Battle of La Legua, was later killed by the DINA. Unlike other factions, the MIR had a policy of no hiding, famously saying, "El mir no se asila." This was because they believed that they could operate entirely from within the shadows in Chile, and because they wanted to show to people that they, unlike the others, weren't going to abandon them. The thing is that this plan was kind of optimistic, and didn't work out to the detriment of the organization's members. Little by little, MIR militants were hunted down. Even high-ranking members, such as Bautista von Schaffen, were eventually killed. Aside from the deaths, many were incarcerated. Of those detained, Arturo Villavela was one of them, and would also find himself in an interesting situation. He was asked by Colonel Ceballos, a member of the CIFA, to relay info to his superiors about an offer that the Air Force was willing to give them. This offer consisted of the MIR laying down their arms, and in return, they'd be given safe passage out of the country. After some thought, Miguel Enriquez refused the deal, and the two sides were back at each other's throats, which meant that plenty more people ended up dying or getting captured. One of the many militants who were captured in 1974 was Erika Cepeda and her husband, Alfonso, who were detained in London 38. While her husband was being tortured and later killed, she discovered that Marcia Merino, also referred to as Flaca Alejandra, had broken under torture and began collaborating with the DINA. She wasn't the only one, as several other members of the MIR and other leftist organizations had also turned, including Luz Acre and Maria Uribe. There were even some who did so more enthusiastically, such as Osvaldo Romo or Guadon Romo, who became one of the DINA's most infamous torturers. By far the most fucked up part of this story is that these three women would go on to form romantic relationships with their captors, if you could even call it romantic, with Flaca Alejandra becoming the partner of Captain Miguel Krasnov. Krasnov was pretty high up in the DINA's hierarchy and was responsible for many of their advances. His most notable victory was probably the death of Miguel Enriquez and the capture of his wife, Carmen Castillo. After this major defeat, Enriquez was succeeded by Andrés Pascal Allende. After the death of their leader, the MIR was in a very desperate situation, and many of its members began fleeing the country. The three women who were forced to collaborate were also in for a rough time. Despite Manuel Contreras giving them their freedom, which basically meant that they were allowed to leave the torture centers where they were being held in, they still had to work for him and his DINA. In fact, both Luz Acre and Maria Uribe oversaw a shootout from within a helicopter that culminated in the death of Dagoberto Perez. Andrés Pascal and several others were also there, but managed to escape, seeking refuge abroad, thus ending the MIR's policy of not going into exile. To further demoralize the MIR, the DINA organized 2 press conferences in Villa Grimaldi with several militants who'd been broken under torture. Even though they were all probably forced to do it, the MIR still labeled these men as traitors and wanted them dead. On top of that, the DINA also wasn't very concerned with their lives, as 2 of them were later killed by the state. With that, round 1 ended with a clear victory for the military regime. But it wouldn't be the end. Despite being bruised and beaten, the MIR licked its wounds and started preparing to return and to fight another day. The Communist Party had, for most of its history, attempted to gain power via popular vote. With Chilean democracy in ruins, the chance of a peaceful revolution was over. Now, the possibility of armed struggle was being considered. One peaceful day in 1977, José Valenzuela Levy, a young Chilean exile living in Sweden, was approached by Luis Canales, also known as the Hat Man. He presented him with an opportunity to join the Communist Party's military plan. He accepted. Levy would embark on a mission, along with 34 other Chileans, to become officers in the acclaimed military academy of Vasilevsky, located in Bulgaria. The goal of this was to prepare a corps of officers that could assume duties in the Chilean army to help rebuild the country once Pinochet was defeated. It was as ambitious as it was important. Once in Bulgaria, the students numbered a total of 31, as the other 3 who were offered to come had refused. The first step was to study the Bulgarian language, as well as other subjects such as history and mathematics in the city of Sofia. It wasn't the easiest of times, but they all got by and finished their studies, except for one of them. Arturo, whose real name is Roberto Oces, backed out at the last minute. While he probably had a valid reason, many of his former classmates labeled him as a deserter and a traitor, refusing to talk to him ever again. This clearly affected Arturo for the worse, as he fell into deep depression. On top of that, he was stuck in Bulgaria. Far from his country, he died in 2007, frozen stiff in the metro. Worst of all, he was buried as an unidentified corpse. His daughter, Gema Oces, has held onto his guitar since his passing. To this day, she has not stopped looking for the remains of her father. Once at Vasilevsky, the first challenge that the Chileans were faced with was getting the proper size of uniforms, as they were shorter than the average student. Their stay would last 3 years, and would be filled with both joy and frustration. However, their training was part of a long-term project, envisioned by the Communist Party. It would be years until they got a taste of action. In the meantime, hundreds of other Chileans were being sent to Cuba. Many of the party's youths would be sent to the island nation to undergo military training. Unlike the training that was given in Bulgaria, those who went to Cuba were given instructions to fight an unconventional war. Training started in 1976. The first to receive it were a handful of students who had gone to study medicine during Allende's presidency. Several other Chilean exiles, such as Raúl Pellegrin, whose nickname was José Miguel, would make their way to the island nation to join those who were already there. Once their training was finalized, Pellegrin and a little under 100 others were given the task of helping the Nicaraguan revolutionaries, known as the Sandinistas, in their fight against the regime of Somoza. They were deployed in 1978 to the Southern Front and received their baptism of fire. Raúl Pellegrin would stick out from the others due to his bravery and leadership skills. During an engagement with Somoza's National Guard, Pellegrin took command of a battalion that had been abandoned by its commanding officer. According to one account, he charged the enemy's positions while hip-firing his submachine gun, rallying his troops to resist. At the end of the day, the National Guard was defeated, and encirclement was avoided. In 1979, the Sandinistas won the war, and started to slowly rebuild their country. As for the Chileans, they would move on to their next task, but it wouldn't be the last time a few of them would set foot in Nicaragua, as their buddies from Bulgaria would partake in their own little adventure. For the most part, the training that the Chileans went through in Vasilevsky wasn't too hard to handle. What was hard for the Chileans was that their contact with the outside world was limited to the city of Veliko Tarnovo. On top of that, they had to maintain a clever story that they were from Cuba. For the most part, they did quite well, but there was one exception. One cadet, who was referred to as Eduardo, stopped attending classes and started hitting his head against the wall until they kicked him out. On a happy note, the Chileans would sing children's songs while marching. Two of the most common were Alicia va en el coche and La Canción del Brindis. The Bulgarians, in their infinite wisdom, believed that these were revolutionary songs that they had brought over from Cuba. To combat the boredom, the cadets would visit the local city to watch movies and would do other things such as hiking. As expected from a bunch of young Chilean men, there were two things on their minds: getting shit-faced and getting laid. This being Eastern Europe, alcoholism wasn't considered an issue, but forming relationships with the local women was, as their superiors didn't want them getting too attached to the city. Two of the cadets, referred to as Gustavo and Leonardo, were adamant on following the rules and enforcing discipline. However, Leonardo, for some reason, couldn't resist Bulgarian pussy and was found by his friends in a bar with his lover. He even went out of his way to speak to Luis Corvalán, the general secretary of the Chilean Communist Party, to get permission to marry the girl, which he was granted. Others would also follow his shining example. Unfortunately, not everyone was happy. Flaco Ivan had received news that his father was detained by security forces in Chile and was now missing. To cope, he drowned his sorrows in a bottle of vodka, slowly giving up hope that he would ever see his father again alive. By 1981, the year of their graduation, the cadets had learned a variety of skills on how to command units and operate equipment. The graduation ceremony was attended by the Bulgarian Defense Minister, Dovred Zurov. I don't fucking know how to pronounce it. Interestingly, he had heard of the incredible musical talents that the Chileans possessed and wanted to listen to some of their revolutionary songs. The Chileans happily complied and sang to their heart's content, with the Bulgarians being none the wiser. After that, Raul, nicknamed El Fosforo, was awarded a golden watch for graduating the top of his class, with Valenzuela Levy coming in at a close second. While everyone was excited to leave for Cuba and initiate their fight against Pinochet, not all of them got the chance. Out of the 29 officers, only 21 left the country, leaving behind 8 of them. It's not fully understood why this was done. As far as I'm aware, we only have explanations for 2 of them. Rodrigo, one of the students left behind, was later given the explanation that they didn't let him go because he was apparently gay, which would get him bullied in Cuba. Another one, nicknamed Paco, was accused of being racist. Between 1976 and 1977, the MIR began reincorporating former militants in its ranks and realized that if they were to defeat Pinochet, they need a base of operations abroad and proper funding to assist their units inside of the country. Of course, they would need to re-establish themselves in the country, which is why they developed Plan 78, later known as Plan Retorno. Interestingly, not everyone was on board with this idea, which created some friction within the organization. For the meantime, this wouldn't be a problem. Our old friend Guillermo Morales was one of the many who would be sent to instruction camps for guerrillas in Cuba. They were being prepared to return to Chile and to wage an insurgency in the mountains of Neltume. Unfortunately for the MIR, the morale of their troops was somewhat lacking, as Guillermo pointed out that one of the trainees straight up refused to return to Chile. It also appears that the Cubans began to weigh some influence on the MIR as they were trying to implement the strategy called Foquismo. To summarize it, it consists of creating decentralized groups of guerrillas to destabilize the government, thus creating the conditions for a revolution. Once that happens, the guerrillas will then go on the offensive and overthrow the state. While Guillermo wasn't against the idea of returning to Chile, he believed that the MIR should focus on creating militia groups to stimulate a popular uprising instead of waging a guerrilla war. When he expressed these beliefs to his superiors, they gave him shit and told him that his thesis didn't align with the party's official line. By 1978, a few hundred militants had begun the process of returning to Chile. However, many of them were detained upon arrival. Sometimes it happened almost immediately, which led to many to believe that Pinochet had informants inside Cuba. Not wanting to end up like the others, Guillermo went off course and made his own plans to return, arriving in the country in 1979. One thing that needs to be pointed out is that the secret police were not as prepared as they were last time to deal with the MIR. In 1978, Carlos Herrera Jimenez replaced Captain Krasnov as head of the unit that was tasked with fighting the MIR. However, this force was a shadow of its former self. To start, the amount of personnel under his command was only around 20, when, in the past, there were hundreds. Lastly, Jimenez points out that the transformation of the DINA into the CNI was not a formal one, and that a lot of the DINA's files on the MIR had been destroyed. Once he contacted other members of the faction, Guillermo was finally able to start his subversive work. He, along with his group, first stole a food truck to hand out its contents to the hungry locals of Chile's poblaciones as a sort of publicity stunt. Speaking of publicity, the MIR even sold a flag that Chile's independence was sworn over. However, this would pale in comparison to what was to come next. The MIR had a lead on a high-ranking ex-DINA agent and began to plot his death. On the 15th of July, 1980, they had the man assassinated. But to their surprise, the guy they killed was Colonel Roger Vergara, who was the director of the Army School of Intelligence, not, in fact, an ex-DINA agent. Because of this, the MIR began to suspect that they had been fed false intel, possibly by Manuel Contreras, as Vergara may or may not have been his rival. Vergara's death was also used as an excuse to sack Orlando Mena, director of the CNI, and definitely one of Contreras' rivals, and replace him with Humberto Gordon. While this was good and all, it didn't change the fact that the MIR was in dire need of cash. So just like in the old days, they devised a plan to simultaneously rob 3 banks. Interestingly, they had robbed these banks in the past, but this time the operation wouldn't go as smooth. During the assault, things started going bad almost immediately. At one bank, a guard shot and injured one of the militants before he himself was killed. Guillermo and his group then bailed out under heavy fire from the carabineros while trying to escape. In the end, 1 member was killed and 2 more were captured. After the heist, Guillermo would dedicate his time to commanding groups of militiamen, up to 100 in fact, just as he had wanted to. The militia under his command specialized in the creation of small bombs that they had then produced to use in arson attacks. They also tried assassinating members of the secret police. The first target was Carlos Tapia, who was killed at the start of 1981. The second was Ingrid Olderlock, a carabinera who was infamous for using dogs to torture and rape her victims. She was shot in the head by a hit squad that same year. Unfortunately, she survived. Even though their first attempt was a failure, the MIR still wanted to wage a guerrilla war in El Tume and organize another group, this time led by Miguel Cabrera Fernández, nicknamed Pino, to begin operations in 1980. The guerrilla started by scouting out the area, establishing hidden camps, and, though this is hard to confirm, getting into contact with Argentine revolutionaries. However, their attempts at forming relations with the locals didn't work out. It didn't help that Pino only had about 20 men under his command. The regime sent a combined force of soldiers, carabineros, CNI agents, and army special forces after the guerrillas, who would soon start to give results. After the capture and death of several militants, Pino was himself killed in October 1981, thus putting an end to this little adventure. Just a few months earlier, Guillermo was captured by the police and sent to jail. During his time in prison, he was even poisoned but managed to survive. Having these 2 blows dealt back to back was rather inconvenient for the MIR and was a bad sign for things to come. Fast forward to 1983, the MIR launched another assassination attempt, this time targeted at General Carol Zua, which was successful. However, the CNI was hot on their tail and eventually tracked those responsible down. What followed is best described as a massacre. The house that Sergio Peña and Lucia Vergara were hiding in was surrounded by CNI agents, who proceeded to gun both of them down even when they tried to surrender. The house caught on fire, with Arturo Villavela inside, and he was burnt to death. Later that day, Alejandro Salgado was killed in a drive-by, and Hugo Ratier was shot inside of his house. Despite Operación Retorno having been a failure, the MIR would never give up fighting, clinging on to hope that one day Pinochet could be defeated. After the coup, the members of the Communist Party debated amongst themselves on possible ways to defeat Pinochet. Many of them didn't know what to do and kind of just moved on, but not all were willing to give up. A group of disenfranchised members met up and created what they called the Guideline for the Policy of Popular Rebellion. Basically, they wanted to fight. Now, it's important to note that none of them believed that they could overthrow Pinochet militarily. However, they did believe that an armed group could create a crisis that would allow for a popular uprising. First, they created the Frente 17, then the Frente Cerro, and later the Comando Manuel Rodriguez, with the latter starting their operations in 1981. Their first ever attack was against several transmission towers located around the city of Viña del Mar, temporarily disrupting an ongoing festival. Interestingly, many of the original members of this organization were former football athletes, such as the future Commander Ramiro from the Orompeyo Social and Sports Club, who had even won a regional championship at one point. By 1983, Chile was going through its worst economic crisis in its history, and discontent for the dictatorship was at an all-time high. On the 14th of December that year, the Frente Patriótico Manuel Rodriguez, or the FPMR for short, was formed as the armed wing of the Communist Party. For those wondering, the faction gets its name from Manuel Rodriguez, a Chilean independence fighter who used guerrilla tactics against the Spanish. Aside from offensive actions against the regime, one of the goals of the FPMR was to act as a self-defense group for people living in Chile's poblaciones, which led to the creation of what they called milicias rodriguistas, which were usually poorly trained and, at times, had homemade weapons. But they were pretty good at throwing rocks at the police, so there's that. The members that formed the organization's national direction were the officers that had been trained in Cuba, such as Raul Pellegrin. The FPMR was unlike any other armed group in Chilean history. They were better armed, better trained, competently led, and, unlike the MIR, most of their members were young and just beginning their political careers, meaning that the state didn't have any info on them. While the FPMR was just getting started, the Bulgarian-trained officers were getting their first taste of combat in Nicaragua, just like those who came before them. After the 21 officers arrived in Cuba back in 1981, they were given extra training suitable for guerrilla warfare, and even helped the Cubans train some of their own officers before they were sent to fight against the Contras, who were basically CIA-backed mercenaries trying to overthrow the Sandinista government. Their time in Nicaragua was rather stressful. Their time was mostly spent walking through the jungle in counterinsurgency operations that were occasionally broken up by firefights and ambushes. After their time in Nicaragua, 5 of them were sent back to Bulgaria for some extra training. 1 went to El Salvador, 1 and perhaps a few more even went to Colombia, and of course there were those who were sent back to Chile. It's almost surprising that not all of them were sent back to fight against Pinochet, and said most of them kind of just screwed around in other parts of the world. In 1985, Jose Valenzuela Levy would become the first of the Bulgarians to return to Chile. While the Cuban and Bulgarian trained officers were certainly helpful, the FPMR had to rely mostly on unskilled civilians recruited from the country's various slums. Juan Moreno Avila, also known as Sasha, began his subversive career in 1982 by participating in protests. By 1983, he was introduced to the FPMR by his uncle Ernesto, who started giving him small tasks, like when he was ordered to transport a rocket launcher in a flower pot. Eventually, Moreno worked his way up the organization, and his uncle put him in contact with Fernando Larena Seguil, also known as Solomon, who gave him the chance to join the FPMR's military structure. Although it would involve going into hiding, Moreno was willing to do it, and was soon sent to Cuba for training. In its early days, the FPMR seemed unstoppable. So far, they had yet to suffer any major defeat, and had ambitious plans for the future. It was the 27th of February in 1986, and around 1 o'clock, the Steinsapier agency in Providencia was being robbed by a group of militants for the FPMR. The heist was a success, only lasting around 5 minutes with no casualties. But most interesting part was that this operation was led by Commander Tamara, whose real name was Cecilia Magni. She wasn't supposed to be there, instead it was Sasha who was supposed to be the one in charge. When she was making her way out of the building, she realized that she was being watched by her boss, Commander Daniel Huerta, who was sitting at a nearby cafe. To that, she simply screamed from the top of her lungs and took off on a motorcycle. 1986 was the year that the Communist Party claimed would be decisive in the fight against the regime, as they had planned to assassinate the head of state himself, Sir Augusto Pinochet Ugarte. The attempt would occur in Cajon del Maipo, as Pinochet would frequently pass through that area on his way to his house to rest for the weekend. The initial plan was to dig a tunnel close to the road and pack it full of explosives, blowing up Pinochet and his whole convoy sky high. They had even acquired a bakery to use as a cover-up for their digging operation. But this plan would be thrown away after the loss of a significant number of weapons and explosives. Several months before, the FPMR had received a large shipment of weapons from Cuba. What they had acquired was a total of 170 M72 Laws, 115 RPG-7s, 3,000 M16 assault rifles, and several tons of explosives and ammunition. The arsenal was stored in a warehouse in Carizal Bajo, located in the city of Villanar, waiting to be distributed for future missions. However, the operation was later detected by the CIA, who informed the Chilean army. On August 6th that year, the state security forces poured down on the warehouse and seized everything in it. After this quite intense screw-up, Valenzuela Levy, who was in charge of killing Pinochet, opted to just shoot the bastard. Cecilia Magni and Cesar Bunster, who was the son of one of Allende's former ambassadors, pretended to be a happy couple that was just looking for a place to stay in the town of La Obra. They eventually convinced the guy to let them rent his place for a few nights. Once they had gotten everything there, Valenzuela Levy gave them all the missions briefing. He gathered everyone into one room, and, looking them in the eyes, he said, "We are going to kill the pig." He also told them that the likelihood of them surviving the mission was rather low. In fact, most of them didn't even know how to properly operate their weapons. However, they were all extremely committed, and none of them backed out. The attack was scheduled to occur on the 31st of August. However, former President Jorge Alessandri had been hospitalized before passing away the next day, and Pinochet wanted to return to Santiago early. The attack was then rescheduled for September 7th. As soon as the riflemen heard news that Pinochet was coming their way, they bolted out of the house and got into position. Most of them stood on the side of a hill next to the road, a few on the opposite side, and 2 more who were tasked with blocking the road with a car and a trailer. Pinochet's convoy was made up of 2 motorcycles and 5 cars, numbering a total of 21 soldiers, excluding Pinochet and his grandson. As soon as the 2 motorcycles passed, the attackers blocked the road with the car and the trailer, and, after a couple seconds, started shooting. When it was all over, 5 of Pinochet's bodyguards lied dead on the road, and not even a single one of the attackers was killed. However, Pinochet managed to get away, largely thanks to the quick thinking of his driver. During the firefight, Marcos, who was along the rear, lined up the sights of his M72 Law onto Pinochet's car. The weapon misfired. He closed it and opened it again to fix the issue, and then it fired. But since he was standing too close to Pinochet, his Law didn't have time to arm when fired and simply bounced off of the car's door. So far, the so-called decisive year was a disaster. After the events in Carisalvajo, the FPMR had lost enough weapons to equip a small army, and their most ambitious operation yet, the attempt against Pinochet, was a failure. From here on out, their luck would only continue to get worse. The first order of action for the CNI was to get revenge for the attack against Pinochet. Apparently, most thought that the best way to do so was to murder 4 people, 2 from the MIR and 2 from the Communist Party. Of course, this didn't achieve much, so the Carabineros, CNI, and investigations quickly got to work on tracking down those involved in the attempt, though they really didn't cooperate much with each other. The higher-ups within the FPMR wanted all those involved in the attempt to leave the country, which many of them did by going to Vietnam and later to Cuba. But not all complied with this order, which would be their undoing. Over at the house that the FPMR used to hide its troops before the ambush, a bottle of Coca-Cola containing fingerprints was found, and investigations soon began working tirelessly to uncover the identity of the owner. Eventually, their efforts paid off, and they discovered that the fingerprints belonged to Juan Moreno Avila, aka Sasha. After paying Sasha's mother a visit, the detectives got his whereabouts and proceeded to arrest him in the middle of the night. Despite the civil police not being as brutal as the CNI, Sasha was still in for a rough time as he was tortured savagely. However, he refused to talk. It wasn't until one of the detectives had the bright idea to bring in the man's family and show them what they had done to him. Seeing Sasha hanging from a pole while naked and bloody was a disturbing sight for his family. Only at the sound of his infant daughter crying did Sasha agree to talk, dooming several of his colleagues to suffer a similar fate. The regime wouldn't stop there, as there were still plenty of militants on the loose. The CNI would organize Operation Albania, a staged confrontation between them and the FPMR to give them a cover-up story for a massacre. The CNI had successfully detained 6 individuals, including Jose Valenzuela Levy, who were either a part of the FPMR or were affiliated with them. While they waited for their unknown fate, the CNI continued to hunt for possible victims, but this time they wouldn't wait and just opted to murder them immediately. Several people were shot dead in their homes, and a few had been killed during a raid on an improvised school for guerrillas. After the raid, which really wasn't a success, the order was given to execute the now 7 detainees. In the early hours of June 16, 1987, the prisoners were taken to a house by the street of Pedro Donoso 582, where their soon-to-be murderers were preparing the scene. They were all taken out of the vehicles and taken to the various rooms of the house. A few minutes later, a rock was thrown on the roof, giving the signal to shoot. The end result was the death of about a dozen people, most of which were denied the ability to fight back. When he heard the news, Raul Pellegrin was quite sad. 3 of the militants killed were some of the FPMR's top members and were personally close to him, especially Valenzuela Levy. On top of that, relations with the Communist Party were quite tense. Since the Communist Party was betting on the FPMR to further their goals, they became disillusioned with their little project of armed rebellion after it failed to bear any fruit. Instead, they wanted to try to beat Pinochet during the soon-to-be 1988 referendum. As expected, Pellegrin and most of the FPMR thought this was a waste of time and wanted to continue fighting, even proposing setting up groups of guerrillas in the mountains. Prior to the events of Operation Albania, Pellegrin and his men attended a meeting with representatives of the party, which ended up turning into such a heated debate that they almost shot each other. Despite bloodshed being avoided, the faction continued to fall apart. Shortly after, Pellegrin, along with most of the FPMR, separated from the Communist Party and declared their faction to be autonomous. To start off this new chapter in the FPMR's short history, the Autonomous Front needed to prove to the public that they were capable of fighting, and, to show everyone, they launched what they called Operación Príncipe, which was basically the kidnapping of Major Cesar Antonio Ramirez, who they believed to have been the one to kill the famous Chilean musician Víctor Jara back in 1973. But it turned out that Major Ramirez did not in fact kill Víctor Jara. So instead they went after Colonel Carlos Carreño, who worked for FAME, which is basically Chile's big state-owned weapons company. During the morning of the 1st of September, 1987, Colonel Carreño was rudely taken from his house by Commander Ramiro and a few other militants. He was then hidden in a safe house while a surprisingly large force of soldiers began looking for them. After around 3 months in captivity, Colonel Carreño was released in the Brazilian city of Sao Paulo. Of course, this only happened because the Chilean government paid a ransom of $50,000 and a few extra things. While this was good enough for the FPMR, the most interesting part of this story came before Operación Príncipe was even started. Remember when I mentioned that a surprising number of soldiers were looking for Carreño? Well, that was for a reason. Colonel Carreño had been tasked with securing an arms deal between the Chilean and Iranian governments. The deal basically consisted of selling Iran 15 F-5s from the Chilean Air Force. Now, selling American-made weapons to the Iranians is very illegal, and there's also the fact that the Chilean Air Force was against losing a good chunk of their fleet. Several years later, the now retired Carreño said that he believes that the FPMR was infiltrated by members of the Air Force, which, if true, would explain why he was kidnapped only one day before going to Iran to secure the deal. Coming into 1988, Chile was getting ready for a plebiscite that would decide whether Pinochet would stay in power. On top of that, it would also be a significant year for Chile's armed resistance. On the 6th of January that year, a group of carabineros were trying to disable a cluster of bombs in a house, which ended up detonating, killing Major Julio Benimeli. It hasn't been 100% confirmed, but it's believed that this act was perpetrated by the MIR, meaning that this could possibly be the last military action the faction committed. Not really that spectacular, especially compared to what's to come. While most of the opposition was trying to beat Pinochet at his own game, the FPMR had other plans as they believed that the plebiscite would be fraudulent. They were preparing to embark on what they called a National Patriotic War, which was meant to kick off a popular rebellion. The operation was planned to take place on the 21st of October, only 16 days after the scheduled plebiscite. The objective of this mission was to temporarily capture the towns of La Mora, Aguas Grandes, Pichipeyahuen, and Los Queñes. Even though Pinochet had lost the plebiscite, the FPMR knew that it wouldn't be the end of him and vowed to continue fighting. Since it was believed that this was the start of a historic moment in Chilean history, several of the FPMR's main leaders, which included Pellegrin, Cecilia Magni, and Bigote, wanted to lead their troops on the ground. During the early hours of the night, the four assault groups began to approach their targets. In the town of La Mora and Aguas Grandes, the FPMR faced little to no resistance and simply left after a short while. In Pichipeyahuen, the attackers had thrown a bomb on the roof of the local police station and then later shot up the building. No one was hurt and the attackers eventually fell back. The attack on Los Queñes differed quite greatly from the rest, both during and after its seizure. To start, Pellegrin, Magni, and Bigote were all present during this attack. Second, the carabinero Juvenal Vargas was shot and killed, while the rest of his colleagues were captured and tied up. Apparently, one of the carabineros even burst into tears because he thought he was going to be executed. A civilian was also injured after confronting the attackers. After blowing up the police station, the assault group retreated into the woods and got the hell out of there. But unlike the other groups, many of them wouldn't get away. After a few days, the bodies of both Raul Pellegrin and Cecilia Magni were found dead in a river. The official statement given out by the authorities was that they had drowned. However, both bodies had signs of electrical torture, leaving very little doubt that both had been murdered. Bigote managed to evade capture, but the militants under his command weren't so lucky and were detained. Since two of the FPMR's main leaders had been killed, and Bigote was the only member of his group to get away, the rest of the faction grew suspicious. During his subversive career, several of Bigote's closest associates had been arrested or disappeared. Bigote himself had also been arrested in the past during a protest. Because of all this, people began to suspect that he was secretly working for the state. Shortly after the disaster in Los Guiñes, Bigote disappeared, never to be seen again alive. Most people point their fingers at the FPMR, claiming that they had him executed. In fact, one of the Bulgarian officers would later claim that his last words went along the lines of, "You can kill me already, but I'm not the only one. There are more on the inside, woo, spooky," all while laughing hysterically. Keep in mind, none of this can be completely confirmed, and his sister Ada would also keep on insisting that committing treason is beyond him. To this day, the fate of Bigote is still unknown, and whether he was a traitor or not has remained a mystery. On March 11, 1990, Pinochet finally handed over his powers to the newly elected president Patricio Aylwin. This, however, didn't mean the end of his power, and Pinochet continued to exert influence as head of the army, with his allies doing the same from other positions. Thus, the FPMR continued to fight, but they would find little glory in this adventure. Arguably, the last major hoorah of Chile's armed resistance occurred on the 30th of January, shortly before President Aylwin was put into office, when 49 members of the MIR, Communist Party, and FPMR escaped from prison in the largest jailbreak in Chilean history. Juan Moreno, aka Sasha, was one of the escapees and, just like many of his colleagues at the time, gave up fighting and tried to rebuild his life. The FPMR also tried assassinating the now retired General Ley, former head of the Air Force and former member of the junta. It didn't quite work out, and Ley survived. On top of all their previous defeats, Cuba finally decided to cut off their funding in an attempt to normalize relations with the new Chilean government. In 1991, the new government also created what they called the Office to combat armed groups shortly after the assassination of Jaime Guzman, who was basically the ideologue of Pinochet's regime. While it may seem cool for a democratic government to hunt down Pinochet's enemies, the fact is that nobody wants to deal with, well, let's face it, political extremists running around with guns. During the last few years of the 1980s, the MIR had split into 3 different groups that, by the return of democracy, had mostly given up fighting. The last group to put down their guns did so in 1997. However, small groups of militants still continue to carry on the MIR's legacy to this day. At least by doing so, they have given their veterans a community to help cope with all the trauma they had suffered during those long 17 years. The FPMR wasn't as lucky, as the faction had officially dissolved in 1996. All that's left of it is a website that is probably run by a bunch of kids who missed their chance to fight Pinochet. To quote the former communist militant Patricio Roman, all those young idealists who gave their lives and the best years of their youth to train as army officers with the false promise that they were going to be the leaders of the future Chilean army, the Communist Party has never paid tribute. On the contrary, they were left abandoned to their fate without having any possibility of returning to a normal life. As for the Communist Party, they've pretty much fallen off. Due to their military policy, they were left isolated from Chile's main political factions. Even when they decided to put down their weapons, they still struggled to gain votes in the ballot box. Despite armed resistance doing arguably nothing to change anything, the idea of bearing arms to bring down a tyrant is still a romantic vision in the heads of many. Because of that, the struggle of the MIR and the FPMR will forever go down in Chile's long and, at times, tragic history.